The reason why 95% of education initiatives in poor countries fail is because of this. Children's toys. Obviously not the children's toy part, I mean the chain, because interventions for education are a chain of processes linked together, and unfortunately, many initiatives focus on only one link of the chain. And sadly, you're gonna realize that so many of the things we advocate for in poor countries are just one-link interventions. But fortunately, you're gonna see in this video an initiative by economists that focused on the entire chain. And as a result, they took kids from illiteracy into fully functioning, educated elementary school kids. It blows my mind what this initiative was able to do. But before we get to that big initiative, let's focus on the biggest problem that most education interventions have, and that is they only focus on the third link of this chain. See, we're told over and over again that for schools to succeed, they need more stuff. Schools need more textbooks, they need more facilities. You see this in colleges in the United States today, where colleges are building water parks for their students, saying this is what we need to make students successful and happy at our university. Fortunately, in the poor world, we are not advocating for these water parks, but sadly, we still see people focused way too much on what goes into the school and not on what's coming out of the school. That's why this link to the chain is so important. We need to focus on results and not inputs. And when you think about it in terms of the chain, it makes total sense. If we're focusing too much on inputs, but we're ignoring the rest of the chain, of course the students aren't going to get much out of these inputs. And through this, I'm going to show you how when we focus on inputs without focusing on one of these other links in the chain, it becomes a total failure. Now, you're probably wondering what these other links in the chain are, so let's go ahead and move to those. Did you know that millions of kids around the world don't even go to school in their first language? And that's because around the world, there are hundreds of indigenous languages that a child learns just in their home. For example, in Mexico, this surprised me, there are 62 official languages recognized by the government of Mexico. It's because you have a lot of people in small villages, in small communities, where they speak a language and then they go up and they learn Spanish. And okay, fine, I understand that you might have to learn a second language to go to school in Mexico. But sometimes these kids aren't even learning school in their second language. So if you go to a country like Kenya, you might have an indigenous language within an ethnicity where kids learn this in their home, but then they have a national language like Swahili, where kids learn this or adults learn this as they want to communicate with other people in Africa who aren't in the same ethnicity as them. And then on top of that, you have English, which is a government national language, but then that ends up being a kid's third language. And yet that's what a lot of the schools teach in is English. And so if a kid wants to go to elementary school and learn, he has to overcome not just his indigenous native language, the second language he learned to speak with everyone else, he has to come up and learn a third language that he's only using in school. This can be incredibly difficult and challenging for kids. And that's why the first link in this chain is making sure that kids speak the language that school is in. Now, this one seems obvious, but it's easy to see why schools and governments focus on an international language. Developing materials for education is tough, it's expensive. You need to have experts who can come in and not just translate, but can actually teach these subjects. And so when you're getting a textbook, you can spend tons of resources on trying to get an indigenous language textbook, or you can just rely on the fact that lots of other countries have already developed an English language or French language textbook that is easy to just drop into these schools and use. You don't have to spend any new resources on creating these materials. The drawback, of course, is that you need to make sure that these kids speak that language, but I can totally understand why these governments focus on an international language. It gets cheaper to supply your school. And then, of course, there's the advantage that it provides on an international labor market. Kids who speak English in school can grow up and get jobs working with English-speaking companies. And nowadays, they don't even have to leave their country to do that. There are jobs that come in through call centers or factories, or a lot of people are taking to freelancing online and taking advantage of this international labor market. But the only way they can do that is if they speak an international language. So I understand the rationale behind using an international language, but then we get into this part where you're gonna have so much trouble bringing this up to other kids to get them the education they need. So you can either focus on making sure the school is in their native language or making sure that the school is in a language they speak. Let's make sure that kids speak English, French, or whatever language it is before they go to school. Now, I said I was going to show you how these connect. And a great example of this is a famous paper in economics. This is a paper that led to somebody getting a Nobel Prize. So some economists, one of them being Michael Kramer, another one being Paul Gluey, said, we want to know what the effect of giving students textbooks on their learning is, right? They're looking at a third link intervention. Let's give them more stuff. Well, they go in, they give the textbooks, and they find that it has no effect on test scores. Why didn't it have an effect? Well, because they ignored the first link. These textbooks were in English. They were not in a language that was widely understood among these students. So obviously, when they start to use the textbooks and they don't understand them, the whole thing falls apart and they don't actually learn anything from those textbooks. So if we're focusing on one of these types of interventions without bringing in the language instruction, we're gonna run into serious problems. But that's just the first link. If you focus on the first link by itself and you ignore the second link, you might as well not do anything at all. This second link reminds me of my high school days. There was a girl I really liked. We had been talking a lot. We were like looking at going on some dates, and suddenly she stopped talking to me. Now, you know, I'm a little bit older, so this is pre-smartphone days. We didn't even have cell phones. I definitely didn't have a cell phone. I don't know about her. I had no way of finding out what was going on, why she was ignoring me at school. She had completely ghosted me. And we have a similar thing happening in schools in developing countries with the second link. We go through, we build the schools, we have the teacher training, we get all these teachers set up to teach, and then a lot of times, teachers don't even show up. In fact, I know a girl who lived in a poor country for high school, and she told me that when they would go to class, if one of the students did not go to the teacher's lounge and tell the teacher that they were there, the teacher just wouldn't come to class. There's a huge problem in developing countries where teachers don't show up to class. So the second link in this chain is making sure that teachers attend. Again, this seems so obvious. Like, obviously, if we want education to happen, teachers need to be in schools teaching. But let's take an example of a one-link intervention that ignored this. In Indonesia, the government wanted to raise teacher salaries. So they thought this was going to be a way to make sure that teachers were more satisfied. Maybe they could attract more teachers, more highly qualified teachers to come in and teach. And so one link intervention, they go in and they raise teacher salaries. And they don't just raise them a little bit, they practically double teacher salaries. But they did nothing to see if teachers were actually going to be at school. As a result, these economists who looked at this program showed that doubling teacher salaries had zero effect on outcomes for students because teachers just stopped showing up. In fact, the only thing that worked was that teachers were now more satisfied with their job. And of course they're more satisfied with their job. They're getting paid twice as much to do the same thing, which was nothing, as they were before. This is just so clear that focusing on one link of the chain ignores what's going to happen if we don't focus on the other links of the chain at the same time. Now, before we get to this final link, I want to talk about some economists who actually went down the whole chain. They were focusing on each of these links. A team of economists and educators went to Guinea-Bissau, which is a former Portuguese colony in Africa and is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's probably not surprising that education there is not that great. By the time kids finish third grade, 35% of them can't even name a letter in the alphabet. It's very bad conditions there. And they have all of these problems. They have the fact that they're a former Portuguese colony, so a lot of them are going to school in Portuguese, and yet they don't speak Portuguese fluently. Their teachers aren't showing up to class. The teachers are striking and canceling classes. And then, of course, with the inputs, they just don't have the materials they need to learn and get the education they want. So the team focused on the whole chain. They gave a full year of Portuguese instruction in preschool to make sure that they were ready for school. They got teachers who were monitored, made sure that they came to class, and then they received the inputs. They had the curriculum they needed. They gave feedback to the teachers to make sure the teachers knew how to better teach their students. And the results are phenomenal. Now, to really understand those results, you're going to need a little bit of a comparison. Let's focus on another one-link intervention on inputs. These are the results from an intervention that focused on lowering school costs. The idea was they were going to give students vouchers, and as long as they performed well in school, they would be able to have discounted tuition to the high school that they chose. And in the end, they saw that the students who received vouchers got higher average test scores than the students who had not. But these two distributions look almost identical. Yes, if you look closely, you can see that the black line is shifted slightly to the right of the gray line, meaning that yes, average scores are higher for those that got the treatment, but mostly they look basically the same. Again, this is a one-link intervention. They're just focusing on inputs, which is let's lower the costs of going to school. And they haven't looked at doing anything else to improve the quality of the schools. So now when you see that, compare that to what happened in this school in Guinea-Bissau. Here on the left is the typical student in Guinea-Bissau who basically learns nothing. All these scores are bunched up down at the bottom of the distribution around 0. And then over on the right are the students who went to the schools that the economists and educators created. Those are shifted so far out to the right, it looks like an entirely different population. These are students scoring well, they are learning. And that is what happens when we focus on a full chain intervention. You probably want to know what this final link is, but I have something to confess to you. I lied. The chain is not just 4 links. There's actually a link even before the language learning, but it looks pretty messed up like this. It is convoluted, it is tough, but if we can get this one put together, that's when we actually start to build the entire chain towards improving education in poor countries. So what is this one? Now you can probably guess already based on what I talked about, right? We want to make sure students speak the language that school is in. We want to make sure teachers are at school so kids can learn. And we want to make sure schools have resources to make sure that the kids can actually learn. None of these are mind-blowing ideas. These are not ideas that you need a PhD or even a college education. You can probably come up with these within the first 5 minutes of observing the problems in these schools. That's why this first one is dealing with dysfunctional systems. So many of the schools are built on dysfunctional systems that even though these links are obvious, the systems don't allow them to be fixed. That's what happened in Guinea-Bissau. What's crazy is this team of economists and educators, they started training teachers. They didn't want to deal with teachers in old systems, so they got their own teachers. But after the training period, these teachers came back and said, we're not going to work unless you give us a raise. And they weren't asking for a small raise. They were asking to be some of the top paid educators in the entire country. This is a clear sign that this system was so dysfunctional that it pervaded even the brand new teachers. They started to sue the economists and educators to try and get higher wages. Now, fortunately, things worked out and this team was able to overcome this incredibly dysfunctional system. And then they were able to link everything else together. But if we can't overcome dysfunctional school systems in poor countries, we're not going to be able to build out the rest of this chain. How do we overcome those dysfunctional systems? It's hard. I don't know the exact answer on this because so many of the systems in developing countries are built on dysfunction. One of the roots behind the dysfunctional systems in a lot of these former colonies is that these schools in Guinea-Bissau, a former Portuguese colony, in Kenya, a former English colony, were built to help bring up the colonial bureaucracy, right? You build a school in English or Portuguese because the bureaucracy is in English and Portuguese. And so you make sure that kids are being prepared for that bureaucracy. But you're not worried about preparing all kids. You prepare just the kids who are destined to be up in that bureaucracy, the elite. So if we really want to 100x education in developing countries, we're gonna have to overcome dysfunctional systems, make sure kids actually speak the language, get teachers to class and give them the resources they need, which then brings us up to this final link. What's the last thing we need to do to really bring human capital and education through the roof in developing countries? Well, we need to get kids to school. We need to get them in the schools so they can actually learn. But if we ignore these other links and just shove a whole bunch of kids into school, really bad things can happen. I actually talk about that in this video, and it'll help you see that we're facing some really bad things in education around the world that needs to be fixed by focusing on the rest of this chain.